And Trump came out and shocked the FBI, the CIA, the DIA, Homeland Security, all good American patriots trying to protect our homeland. He came out and said, I don't trust them. I don't trust the CIA. I trust this former KGB officer, Vladimir Putin, when he tells me there was no Russian interference in the 2016 presidential elections.
Welcome to the Black Sky. My name is Piotr Mateusz Bobołowicz, and our guest today is Professor Glyn Williams from the Department of History of the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth, expert on Islam and Russia, who worked for the CIA's Counter-Terrorism Center. Good afternoon, Mr. Professor.
Good afternoon, Piotr.
Let me start with very widely spoken topic. Have you seen Tucker Carlson's interview? Let me call it interview for lack of a better word, but I'm not sure if it should be called interview with Vladimir Putin. What do you think about it?
Yes, I have seen Tucker's so-called interview, although I would call it a largely unchallenged Putin monologue and disinformation-filled lecture. It was uncomfortable to watch. It was disturbing because there was no real energy or synergy between Tucker and Putin, who just gave this long, rambling, lie-filled story, propaganda-filled story about distant history. You know, it was a real historic chance for Putin and for Trump, who are both on the same page. You know, they're collaborating to try getting Putin's view to the world, to convince Republicans and all those who believe in this deep state nonsense and who want Russia to win the war in the West and in America, followers of Tucker, convince them not to believe that Russia's a threat, to disarm Putin, to give him a chance to convince them why we shouldn't support Ukraine and let him continue his rampage. And it didn't work. You know, it was a complete and utter failure, a flop, a nothing burger, because Tucker couldn't convince Putin to floor with him and take his softball questions, these we call them alley-oops, slam dunks. Tucker Carlson was feeding him softball, easy questions designed to make NATO look bad, designed to make America look bad, and to make Russia look great, and to make Ukraine look like a false country. And Putin just went off the deep end with this ridiculous, almost insane narrative going back to the 900s that won't appeal to any Americans. No one's listening to 45 minutes of his rambling.
Well, as a history professor, I think it could be especially challenging for you to watch such nonsense. But what is the reception of this interview in the US? What do you think can it be? Because, honestly speaking, the Americans are not so well known for their knowledge of history, especially of the history of Eastern Europe. So I think for many people it's the first contact, so they don't have any comparison. So what people in the US will think about it?
You know, you're correct. You know, we don't have the patience, for the most part, for long historical narratives. You know, Putin was going back to 1654, trying to make these territorial claims to quote unquote our lands, to quote unquote Russian lands, which are of course Ukrainian lands. And the Americans, if we're going to go that far back, in 1654 we were colonies of England, so it's not going to resonate with Americans. And it was such an arcane, esoteric historical journey, full of just diatribes and tangential information. It didn't win Putin over to any new American audience. On the contrary, if Tucker's agenda and his whole point for this so-called interview, which was actually an unchallenged monologue, if his whole point was to allow Putin to win over people and win hearts and minds in America. It failed because it was just so, off the rails. It just didn't actually resonate with Americans who don't have the patience for going back to 1000 AD to hear about Vladimir the Great, or Bogdan Khmelnytsky in 1654. It was completely a lost opportunity for Putin. He could have reached those, deep state distrusting Tucker Carlson fans who want to see Putin win, or right wingers who believe in Trump's vision, where you can threaten NATO members and you call Putin a friend. Putin could have reached them by giving them red meat, talking about how NATO started the whole thing and he's just an innocent victim, and explaining things that are current to today. But instead, he went down the dark rabbit hole of ancient history and completely lost his Tucker Carlson moment.
But don't you think that Americans can just believe his story, his alternative history, as he said it? Because, well, as Tucker Carlson, who apparently had no knowledge of Ukrainian history nor Russian history, I was really surprised to see that he didn't really even know a thing about the modern history of Ukraine. However, he decided to, go on and let Putin go on with this alternative history.
Yeah, it was fascinating to see Tucker Carlson's reaction. Obviously, he was frustrated. One time he asked, Putin, what's the relevance of this? And he asked, what century are we talking about here? Tucker Carlson was no doubt horrified at the way things were getting out of control. But Putin did finally get around to more modern times. And when he made outlandish, propagandistic, flat-out false claims about history, Tucker Carlson was there, fawning obsequiously, unchallenging, just shaking his head like a puppet and agreeing to everything he said. It wasn't a hardball real interview. It was Tucker Carlson shamefully, spinelessly fawning over this dictator, this mass murderer, and giving him an unchallenged platform. And when Putin did make propagandistic disinformation, Tucker Carlson was there all the way, supporting him and backing him up. For example, when Putin said, we had to invade Ukraine, they have Nazism, they're Nazis, we're denazifying it, which is absurd. Nobody actually believes that Putin had to invade Ukraine to stop a Nazi takeover of Europe. Anybody else would have challenged him on this absurdity. But Tucker Carlson nodded along and said, it must be very difficult to overcome this ideology. How did you do it? And when Putin said, I had to invade Ukraine, Tucker Carlson egged him on and almost chastised him and said, why didn't you take it earlier? Why didn't you take Ukraine, quote unquote, take it, earlier? There have been some moments when Putin did, with Tucker Carlson's aiding and abetting, get his message across. For example, Putin explained to Tucker Carlson that some of Ukrainian territory had been added to Ukraine by the Soviet Union after World War II by taking territory from Ukraine. And of course, Tucker Carlson was outraged and said, well, can't you tell Viktor Orban, the leader of Hungary, to go get it back? So I think Putin may have, enabled the lies a little bit with some, guidance and help from his so-called interviewer, Tucker Carlson.
It was quite surprising that he didn't speak about those conservative values that many people in the West think that Russia shares or promote or preserve. But do you think, nonetheless, can it have some impact, some implications on U.S. audience, on those Republicans who are not really sure if they should help Ukraine or not? What implications can this interview have?
Well, several prominent Republicans who are among that small clique that are supporting Trump, who's trying to torpedo aid to Ukraine. He's trying to torpedo this new aid package, which has been passed by the Senate. $91 billion, all linked together for Taiwan, Israel, and Ukraine. 61 billion of it will go to keep Ukraine in the battle. They're running out of artillery. They took all these massive gains around Kharkiv and Kherson last fall. They failed in their much vaunted wall of steel offensive this summer, but they're barely holding on. They're running out of ammunition for their artillery, and what is largely an artillery war. They desperately need America, the arsenal of democracy that's always stood up to these sort of tyrants and aggression around the world. Zelensky needs that aid package, and Putin's message has been promoted via this so-called interview by several prominent Republicans, among them Sarah Palin, who famously, I think, helped destroy John McCain's run for presidency, and members of this right-wing clique, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's really off the charts, pro-Russian, anti-Ukraine Republican. They are promoting this interview, but I don't think it's really resonating with too many people because it's just so tedious. And Tucker Carlson, God bless him, utterly failed to create any sort of real bond and sympathy for Putin. On the contrary, Putin comes off as this rambling, insane, obsessed with obscure history, weird autocrat. And there's nothing sympathetic or likable about him from this interview. And that means that both Putin and his aider and abettor, Tucker Carlson, really failed in this magical once-in-a-lifetime moment where Tucker Carlson gave Putin a window, a voice to America.
However, Tucker Carlson didn't lose so much sympathy, as I heard Ben Shapiro criticizing what Putin said, but he didn't criticize Carlson that much. We'll get to him back later, but now I would like to ask you, do you think that this aid for Ukraine will be finally accepted by both chambers and it will be given to Ukraine?
I can't predict. The Senate passed it, and the Senate seems to be more balanced, less filled with these pro-Trump, pro-Putin extremists than the House. So it's passed one chamber of Congress, the Senate, but now it's in the hands of the House. And it's hard to predict how those members will vote because a small minority of them, most Republicans are old school Cold Warriors. Remember the Reagan era when Reagan stood up to Russia and famously told Gorbachev, tear down this wall, in Berlin, Mr. Gorbachev. The majority of Republicans still have that sort of staunch, stalwart stance against Moscow. But this wing of Trump-controlled pro-Putin members in the House may yet still sabotage this $91 billion package, which will stop aid not just to Ukraine, but to something they care about, Israel, and also Taiwan. So the hope is that the combining, the wrapping of all three of these aid packages into one will somehow sugarcoat it and allow these House members who are Republicans to pass this bill and get that aid, which is desperately needed by those Ukrainian troops who are barely holding the line in Avdiivka and other parts of eastern Ukraine. This comes, as you know, just as the European Union passed a bill, a massive bill, giving $54 billion in aid to Ukraine. If both those packages go through, Ukraine can survive. But if that $61 billion from America doesn't get through, they'll be missing their Excalibur GPS-guided artillery, missiles for their HIMARS systems, the Patriot system, which has been so crucial in shooting down these Iranian Shahed 136 drones and supersonic Kinjal missiles, and saving Ukrainian lives, they will lose all this much needed money and weapons that will help them survive this onslaught as Russia transitions to a wartime economy and keeps throwing bodies into these human wave, meat wave assaults to try and do like a Bakhmut style assault on this small pocket of Ukrainians at Avdiivka.
But if I assume correctly, this money, most of those, I think it's 70 billion for Ukraine, will be spent in the US. So it should be good for American economy also.
Well, absolutely. A lot, as you correctly suggest, a lot of that money will be going back towards backfilling supplies that we've already given to the Ukrainians, giving to the arms industry. The American jobs will flourish. You pump in tens of billions of dollars of basically stimulus money into the American economy, jobs go up. It'll help bring down unemployment. It'll keep American arms industry employees at work. So this is a win-win for America, for democracy, for our job in protecting a freedom-loving, democratic nation that's seeing its people annihilated in a World War II style, Hitler style blitzkrieg on their country. It stands for everything America stands for. But this small pocket, including Trump, don't stand for what America has traditionally stood for, which is democracy over tyranny, supporting allies and democracies around the world, and supporting a strong NATO. We saw, I think 2 days ago, Trump came out and basically dog whistled Putin, gave him signals saying, he told to NATO leaders, if NATO leaders don't pay 2% of their economy towards NATO, he will tell Russia to invade them. I mean, this is unhinged on Trump's part, but it certainly is much welcome news to Putin and to his forces who are rampaging, murdering, and slaughtering in a free democracy on the border of NATO in Europe.
As we are speaking, as this interview will be published, probably the deal will be already passed through the Senate or not. We'll know, but we don't know now, but it will happen this week probably. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk a few days ago criticized Republican senators, saying that President Reagan is turning in his grave watching today's Republicans as they reject aid for Ukraine. What happened since Reagan in the GOP that many people changed so much that the voters of GOP changed so much?
Yeah, that's funny you mentioned that Reagan is turning in his grave. I teach a class on the Ukraine war at University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. And I bet my students that Tucker Carlson would not ask about Alexei Navalny. He would not ask about the Bucha massacre and rape of all those poor Ukrainian women and kids and people. Or Tucker Carlson would not ask Putin, sorry, I can with Trump, Freudian tumble. He would not ask Putin about the extermination of the city of Mariupol. What happened to the Republican Party? I actually said that Reagan is turning in his grave, as is John McCain, and all those Americans who died fighting communism during the Cold War, in North Korea or Vietnam or elsewhere, Grenada. What happened to the great party that even when presidential candidate Mitt Romney was running against Obama, Romney said Russia is our main enemy that recently? How did this whole party overnight go from being the most anti-Russian, anti-China, they're linked together, and they're still anti-Chinese, they're still anti-communism, they're still calling about defending Taiwan from a non-existent invasion. But that party, a huge chunk of it, not all of it, Mitch McConnell, the head of the Republican Senate, is still staunchly anti-Russia, and a lot of the old school hawkish, right-wing, strong foreign policy Republicans are still anti-Putin. But a huge section of the electorate has come under Trump's influence since 2016. And he is the one who has almost single-handedly convinced a vast swath of Republicans that Russia is good. It's not bad anymore like China still is. It's almost like he pulled a Star Wars Jedi mind trick and convinced his party, up is down and down is up. He convinced them that Russia, which has always been an enemy of Republicans, going back to the 50s, Truman, Eisenhower, the whole Cold War, Republicans were staunchly supplying NATO, leading NATO under Reagan, etc. The whole party, under Trump's influence, has tilted strongly against democracy and for totalitarian regimes, against supporting allies, for isolationism. And it comes, no doubt, due to Putin's blatant Pearl Harbor style attack on our election in 2016, when him and his troll farms spread this disinformation campaign in an effort to stop Hillary Clinton, who've been criticizing his human rights approach towards protest, to stop Hillary Clinton from becoming president and helping what they saw as an ally in the White House, Donald Trump, become president. And once Trump became president, famously, he went in Helsinki and told the whole world media, after talking secretly to Vladimir Putin, Trump said, "No, I believe Vladimir Putin." Vladimir Putin told me, "No, and yet I didn't do any interference in your election." And Trump came out and shocked the FBI, the CIA, the DIA, Homeland Security, all good American patriots trying to protect our homeland. He came out and said, "I don't trust them. I don't trust the CIA. I trust this former KGB officer, Vladimir Putin, when he tells me there was no Russian interference in the 2016 presidential elections." This began the process of Trump convincing his people, his party, his supporters, the Trump MAGA supporters, that Russia was suddenly now great. China's still bad, but Russia, good.
Do you think that if Donald Trump gets elected, will he fulfill his promise of ending the war in Ukraine in 24 hours? And how could he possibly manage to do it?
Well, Trump talks a big game. He promised when he was elected that he would send his son-in-law over to Jared over to Israel to solve the centuries old or decades old Israel-Palestinian crisis. That didn't happen. But what we fear is that Trump won't solve this war. On the contrary, he will collapse in the face of Putin's aggression. He will disengage. He'll engage in retrenchment. He told John Bolton, his national security advisor, that if he won re-election, which he lost, he would pull America out of NATO. He doesn't like NATO. He clashed with Angela Merkel, the largest NATO army in Europe, and made friends with Putin. He clashed with Zelensky for not surrendering to his quid pro quo mafia-style shakedown to give him dirt on Biden, for which he got impeached. He didn't like Zelensky for standing up to him, so he started saying, "Oh, Ukraine is corrupt. Ukraine is terrible." At the same time, he's calling Putin, quote unquote, a genius for invading Ukraine. Now, all military historians will tell you Putin is no Napoleon, no Genghis Khan, no military genius. He's catastrophically run this war in Ukraine, which has led to over 300,000 casualties for his people, according to the CIA. Over 300,000. We lost 7,500 in 20 years of war in two theaters of action in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Putin is no military genius. It's been a catastrophe for his country. But if Trump is elected, Putin is counting on him withdrawing all support, pulling the plug on these aid packages that have kept Ukraine in the battle, and quote unquote solving the war by throwing Ukraine under the bus. We say under the bus metaphorically, but throwing Ukraine under the T-90 Russian tank to be more realistic.
Donald Trump, as you said, mentioned that, that if he got reelected, he would draw the US from NATO. It didn't happen, of course, because Joe Biden was elected. But recently he said that if the NATO countries don't pay the required 2% of their GDP towards defense, he would not only not help them, but encourage Russia to do whatever it wants with those countries. And do you think, is it a real threat, or maybe is it just a way to force those countries to fulfill their security obligations under the NATO? Or maybe is it some kind of looking for an excuse to not fulfill the security obligations on the US side if some countries get attacked, regardless of their payment towards their defense? For example, if Estonia or Latvia gets attacked, Trump would just find an excuse to not help them.
I have no doubt it's the latter explanation. Article 5 of the NATO Convention says that if one country in NATO is attacked, they are all attacked. It was only put into force once, and that was when America, of all things, was attacked on 9/11. And NATO troops helped America fighting in Afghanistan. I actually worked at a forward operating base in Afghanistan, and at the time, Turkey, a NATO member, was in charge of all NATO operations in Afghanistan. So NATO was there for us when we got attacked on 9/11. But Trump doesn't know that history. He's not a historian any more than Tucker Carlson is, who never even heard of, the Cossacks. Another thing that didn't come up in his so-called interview. I think personally, Trump is looking for an excuse for America to disengage from the world. He's a America first. He calls it isolationist. Now, we've seen this before. In October 2019, we had troops in Syria fighting side by side with these pro-women's rights, pro-Christian rights, democratic Kurds against the ISIS terrorists. And all of a sudden, Trump abandoned them and gave Turkey a green light to go in and invade and massacre them. Trump gave the autocratic, totalitarian leader of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the green light to invade our allies. And the Turks stormed in to post-American withdrawal of northern Syria, killing and slaughtering and burning and ethnically cleansing Kurds who had been our frontline battle allies loyally against ISIS for 3 years. He has no concept of loyalty. The Green Beret Honor Code, the Green Berets were great friends with these Kurds. I don't think he has any sense of loyalty to NATO, to European countries. I think he was telegraphing his intentions when he said he would ask Putin or Russia to invade those countries that didn't pay enough. I don't think he wants to go to war for Article 5 any more than he wanted to go to war alongside the Kurds to continue the job of defeating the ISIS global terror threat. He disengaged us from Afghanistan. People forget it was Donald Trump and his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who signed the withdrawal treaty with the Taliban that Biden later came into office and agreed with. So Trump pulled troops out of Afghanistan. He organized the whole thing for years in Doha with Mike Pompeo at the helm. He pulled American troops out of the war operations in Somalia, in Syria. And according to John Bolton, his national security advisor, his goal was to withdraw America from NATO, the most successful military alliance in all history. He doesn't understand alliances. He doesn't understand NATO. He doesn't understand the history of Hitler's aggression that led to World War II, and doesn't see the parallels with Putin's current invasion of Ukraine, which is, tantamount to Hitler invading the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, and Swiss going into Austria.
You mentioned Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Mm, and you said that he attacked Kurds. The U.S. led the ethnic cleansing, but Turkey is a NATO member, is the U.S. ally.
That's true. And it was a hard path, a hard, delicate balancing act for Obama to walk. Obama leveraged the Syrian Kurds and saved them with air support in the famous Battle of Kobani uh, in 2014, when thousands of ISIS fanatics were trying to exterminate their pro women's rights, secular democracy in northern Syria. The balancing act Obama had to walk was, how do you leverage this proxy surrogate fighting force, which laid down 7,000 other soldiers' lives, to defeat the global terrorist scourge of ISIS? You know, there's ISIS attacks in Belgium. Who can forget the attacks in Paris, in New York, all over the world? You had to destroy ISIS terror state. It was a plague on humanity. And we were not willing to launch another full-scale Bush Jr. Iraq war, conventional war in the Middle East. There's no appetite for that among the American voters or the Pentagon or Obama. So what did Obama choose to do? He aided and assisted the Kurds, and it worked. It was the most effective proxy war in world history. We annihilated the ISIS caliphate from 2014 to 2019, killed over 70,000 other fighters with only less than a dozen American lives lost. But lives were lost, and it was our proxy allies, the Kurdish Peshmerga in northern Iraq, the mainly Shia Iraqi security forces, and the YPG Kurds in northern Syria. And of course, when you arm and support the YPG Kurds in northern Syria, you're gone to make the Turks nervous and angry. I was living in Turkey. I speak Turkish. I was living there every summer and following as the Turks watched the Kurds advance against ISIS on their southern border in neighboring Syria. And it caused real alarm amongst Turkish nationalists. So, you know, it was a damned if you do, damned if you don't option for Obama. I understand Turkey's fears. I think they're overblown. I don't think the YPG Syrian Kurds who are fighting for their lives against ISIS have any designs on Turkish lands in a powerful NATO member called Turkey.
Let's stay in the Middle East. How can this current situation in the Middle East, the war of Israel with Hamas and Houthis in Yemen, affect the U.S. engagement in helping Ukraine in its defense against Russia? How can it, in total, in whole, affect the global security?
Well, you know, I don't think the crisis stemming from the October 7th Hamas Al-Aqsa flood rampage and rape and murder spree in those poor kibbutzes and that concert in southern Israel, and the war, the disproportionate war that Netanyahu has launched against this prison camp called Gaza, which has killed over 26,000 Palestinians and infuriated the Houthis, who've used it as a pretext to attack the shipping lanes and the Red Sea, which carry 15% of global traffic per year. None of this helps American aid and assistance and focus on Zelensky. On the contrary, it sucks all of the oxygen out of the American public's sympathy for Ukrainians, out of the Pentagon's budget, out of the American public's focus and the Congress's focus. It is a distraction. You know, I watch the news. I bounce from channel to channel here in America, from Fox to MSNBC to CNN. The news coverage was saturated, you know, from February 24th when they invaded Ukraine up until October 7th with Ukraine. You know, we followed the sinking of the Moskva. We cheered them when they sank the Moskva and shot down Sukhoi 34s and stormed into Kherson in the south and liberated the areas around Kharkiv. You know, we as Americans identified with Ukrainian Davids against the Russian Goliaths, well, except for Trump supporters who are supporting the Goliath. And then suddenly, you know, America's divided. Biden gave unadulterated full support to Netanyahu. He flew there and embraced him, which makes pro-Israel right-wing Republicans kind of happy. Although he got no mileage with them because they hate Biden so much, anyways. And instead, all he did was infuriate Democrats, liberals, left-wing Democrats, who are horrified by these sickening images of carnage and mass destruction as the Israelis indiscriminately basically flatten and do a Dresden or a Hiroshima or an Aleppo to Gaza and wipe out thousands and thousands and thousands of innocent Palestinian men, women, children who aren't part of Hamas.
Let's skip to Joe Biden. There are many concerns that maybe he's unable to be president any longer. Recently, he has said something about speaking with Mitterrand, with Helmut Kohl, who are both dead for a long time. Are those concerns real? What do you think is happening with Joe Biden? Is he able to still be a president and be effective president?
They had this special investigation over his handling of documents that declared that he there's nothing illegal. He wasn't charged with hiding them from the FBI for months the way Trump was, with all his documents hidden in boxes and boxes all over Mar-a-Lago down in Florida. And during that investigation, the special prosecutor said that he couldn't remember when his son was killed or when he died. And this caused headlines across America. And it feeds into the narrative that he is too old. And there are real concerns, as he approaches this age, that he is too old. Those same concerns apply to Trump, who's, I think 4 or 5 years younger than him, and also landed in places like Kansas City and gave a speech and didn't know where he was. He didn't know the names of world leaders either. All you have to do is go online and type in either candidate's names and memory loss gaffes, embarrassing memory loss quotes and things, and you're going to get lots of evidence that both of these guys, Trump, who people forget, he's almost the same age as Biden, and he clearly has some sort of mental issues. Who knows what the mental issues are, and that Biden is also forgetful, and what happens in 3 or 4 years, God forbid if he does win, or if Trump, God forbid, wins, and either one of them gets dementia or Alzheimer's. So these are bona fide fears. A lot of people in America from both parties, especially young people, would like to have somebody new from either side, somebody younger. Nikki Haley was gaining traction for a while there. DeSantis flamed out. He was the great white hope for Republicans, the GOP, who were hoping for an alternative to all this chaos, this anti-Americanism, traditional anti-American values, like standing by our allies, defending yourself against dictatorships, defending democracy that Trump is espousing. The wing of the Republican Party that wanted anybody but Trump, the never Trumpers, were banking all their money on DeSantis and his culture wars, attacking gays and attacking Walt Disney World and Bud Light and these things. It went on some support for a while, but Trump is Godzilla. He is a master of what used to be the Republican Party that is now basically a cult of personality, except for a small wing that's still like Mitch McConnell and others who are trying to keep it on a course of the old Republican values, the old family values and Christian values and those things that used to be the hallmark. They're now instead basically a cult of hero worship. There doesn't seem to be any alternative, though. Nikki Haley won't be able to beat Trump. The headwinds are against her. The party faithful are loyal to Trump in a way we've never seen people in America to any president before. Forget Biden. He has no such cult following. Obama didn't. The closest thing they had was probably Reagan, the great communicator, who won a lot of support from Democrats and Republicans. And Democrats call him, I guess, Reagan Democrats.
As I said before, let's get back to Tucker Carlson. I have a few more questions about him. Trump's son suggested that Tucker could be Trump's vice president, although Tucker himself rejected such ideas. Do you think there will be a place in the White House if Donald Trump wins?
No. There's a reason for that. Tucker Carlson was part of a massive lawsuit by a voting machine company in America called Dominion. Dominion created the voting machines that were used in the 2016 presidential and congressional elections. Trump and his Fox News supporters came out and baselessly, falsely accused Dominion of hijacking the election, which you can't do. And you can't, it's called libel. You get sued for that in this country and most countries. You can't just say somebody raped somebody or some company, McDonald's, is killing babies, or Dominion stole the election, especially the election, by the way, 2016 congressional election that Republicans cleaned house on and won using those same machines, the same voting machines. No one in that group, Trump supporters, mentions that discrepancy. People voted overwhelmingly for Republicans in that election, but Trump lost. And Fox News came out and falsely proclaimed that Dominion voting machines stole his election. It's nonsense, of course, it's absurd. But this is the era of QAnon, or people believing that, birthers who believe that Obama snuck into America like Moses in a baby basket and snuck into America and stole our country. There's all kinds of people who believe anything, especially on that sort of lunatic fringe QAnon style right wing party. And Tucker Carlson was part of this lawsuit, and as part of the lawsuit, Fox News somehow revealed some of his private emails, and in them it was revealed, lo and behold, that Tucker Carlson said, "I hate Donald Trump." Basically he said, "I can't wait for this guy not to win the election, so I have to deal with him again." So he was caught with his pants down, actually vocalizing his deep hatred for Donald Trump. Something he's also said, by the way, in the past about, guess who? Vladimir Putin and Russia, back before he became a fawning, obsequious mouthpiece for Putin to gain followers. So Trump was infuriated by these comments by Tucker Carlson saying he hated Trump. But they made up in the interest of fighting the common foe, Ukraine, democracy. And a few months later, Tucker Carlson did a fawning, obsequious interview, strikingly similar to the Putin interview, only with Donald Trump. So the deep blood, the blood has been split. Tucker Carlson has revealed his true, utter contempt for Donald Trump. So there's no way Trump, who's a narcissist, who's egomaniacal, there's no way he wants to share the limelight with someone who's a fellow limelight grasper, Tucker Carlson.
In November, Politico, who probably no one would suspect to have any pro-Trumpist or pro-Tucker Carlson views, called Tucker Carlson Trump's shadow diplomat and suggested that his many travels and interviews with such people as Viktor Orban or Javier Milei, which was, by the way, just a month before his victory in the Argentinian elections, Politico suggested that it had some hidden agenda. And do you think it is true? Do you think that maybe Tucker Carlson has some special role to play? And if it is a case, what could be his agenda in Russia besides obviously meeting Putin and spreading his words?
Well, I don't think Tucker Carlson has a hidden agenda. I think it's a bright and a broad spotlight agenda. As soon as Trump began praising dictators, he went and embraced Kim Jong-un in North Korea in a failed bid to get the Nobel Peace Prize and then overcome Obama's Nobel Peace Prize. Trump loves dictators. He's called Putin a genius after Putin had these war crimes spotlighted, including the burning and raping of women in Bucha. So Trump is friends with Tucker Carlson. That network has a personal relationship with him, including Sean Hannity, another pro-Trump information disseminator. Twisted information, everything cheerleading for Trump. Fox News is good to watch during the day when it has lots of great news, but at night it's just a propaganda show. I think Tucker Carlson, as soon as he heard that Trump was praising the right-wing pro-Putin leader of Hungary, Viktor Orban, the first thing Tucker Carlson did was fly to Budapest, Hungary, and do a week-long Hungary is Great show highlighting how wonderful Viktor Orban is. It was, once again, shameless trademark Tucker Carlson fawning of a dictator. And it's not surprising that during Tucker Carlson's messaging for Putin, his so-called interview, that he came out and he spoke on behalf of Viktor Orban and said, well, Putin, you've said that Hungary's lands were taken by Ukraine after World War II. Putin, didn't you call Viktor Orban up and tell him to get those lands back? He also chastised Putin once during a so-called interview by saying, you've been president for 24 years. Why didn't you get the lands in Ukraine back earlier? So there's no doubt where the Tucker Carlson stands. He wants Ukraine to be dismembered and disemboweled and cut to pieces by not just Vladimir Putin and his mass murdering, rapist, city-destroying army who engaged in a Wehrmacht-style blitz across civilian-filled lands in eastern Ukraine. Tucker Carlson is also signaling that Viktor Orban should also invade Ukraine and dismember parts of it. So, not only is Tucker Carlson enabling Vladimir Putin and giving him an unchallenged voice, cheerleading for him, basically, egging him on. Just you can see him hovering, waiting to work with hand in glove with Putin to get his message across. And Putin did get his message across sometimes. And one time he said, if America stops supplying weapons to Ukraine, this war will be over in a week. Don't you have better things to do, like your borders, Mexico? Of course, if America and the European Union and NATO stop supplying weapons to Ukraine, the war will be over because Ukraine will cease to exist. I think, I don't know if you can call Tucker Carlson Trump's shadow diplomat or shadow ambassador, but certainly he was walking in lockstep with everything. He hinges on every single word Trump says.
I'm heading towards the end. In March 2022, during one of the interviews, you said that the West needs to give Putin some way to save face, some sort of exit ramp, and you said that it could be, for example, letting Putin keep Crimea or Donbas. Almost 2 years later, do you still think it is a good idea? Do you think it is possible to stop Putin with some territorial concessions?
Yeah, I remember the interview with you, Piotr. It was in Brussels at the European Union Parliament. And I said, we need to give Putin some face-saving way.
Just to clarify, it wasn't our interview. It was some other interview, your interview.
Right.
I found online, yes.
Right, yeah. So it was an off-ramp that I suggested that somehow Putin could save face. He didn't bank on such stupendously brave and resilient, almost like the Finns in 1939 against the Soviet invasion, Ukrainian resistance against his much larger force. They used to say Russia, second largest army in the world, now has the second most powerful army in Ukraine. They're getting obliterated on the battlefields. They're losing thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of their men, over 2,000 of their tanks. The Air Force is being decimated. It shouldn't be happening like this for Putin. And of course, NATO came through in ways that he didn't expect either. He thought they'd be feckless. America and NATO weren't too strong on him when he invaded Crimea back in the spring of 2014, and we invaded Donbass. And lo and behold, NATO came through, Ukrainians came through and shocked him. He needs an off-ramp. They had the peace talks in Istanbul. They failed. And he blamed Ukrainians. Ukrainians blamed him. Neither side at this moment feels the need for peace talks. And the Ukrainians want those people freed. There's millions of Ukrainians living in Russian-occupied territory who can't speak their language. They're being forced to get Russian passports. They're being arrested for singing in Ukrainian. Their children are being kidnapped in what the International Criminal Court has called a war crime and has indicted Putin for. So there's got to be a way for this war to reach a stalemate. To have like a frozen conflict like we had in parts of the teeny country of Moldova called Transnistria, or in parts of northern Georgia called North Ossetia, or in parts of the other part of northern Georgia called Abkhazia. In all those cases, Russia intervened militarily in one of its post-Soviet neighbors, conquered some territory, and those gains were frozen. I believe Russia's might, its military prowess, its massive superiority in numbers, in industrial strength, won't, and in fact, it has these deep trenches dug right across eastern Ukraine, the so-called Surovikin line, anti-tank trenches and anti-personnel trenches, landmines, artillery. The Ukrainians had their moment last summer with all the incoming Leopard tanks from Germany, the HIMARS missiles from America. Everything was at their backs. The Bradley fighting vehicles, which you've seen decimate and destroy even main battle tanks, Russian tanks destroyed by American Bradley vehicles. Everything was primed for Zaluzhny, the top Ukrainian general who's just been fired, to punch through the lines all the way down to Melitopol and break the Russian land bridge to the Crimea. They failed. They didn't grab almost any territory. That was Ukraine's last moment, I believe, because the lines are just solidifying. The Russians have revamped their economy to be a wartime economy. The whole economy won't last forever doing this. Russians are losing heating across the country. The civilians are suffering. But for now, it's keeping the war alive with the sheer numbers of human wave assaults. They can lose 40, 50,000 people, and they don't mind. These are Russians. That's how they've always fought. Ukrainians can't do that. So I think sooner or later, Zelensky and his people, who are angry at the Russians for the destruction of Mariupol, the indiscriminate butchery of thousands in Mariupol and Bucha and other towns, they don't want to release 20% of the country to these Hitler-style invaders. But I hate to say it, reality is going to have to set in sooner or later that Russia has cleaved off and carved off that 20% of Ukraine, Donetsk, Luhansk, parts of Kherson, and of course Crimea, which is historically been Russian until 1954, when it was given to Ukraine by Khrushchev. It's going to have to. I think I don't want to. I don't want this myself, and it's not for me, as an American, to tell them to do this. Only Ukrainians themselves, a democratic country, have the right to decide if they're going to trade this land for peace. But I think that's sadly the inevitable fate of a country that is much smaller in population, industrial capacity, fighting potential, and sheer fanaticism. They can't throw their troops in these meat waves, these World War I style human wave assaults, the way Russia can. They care too much about their soldiers, and they don't want to keep this endless bleeding going forever. I don't think. I don't know when that day will happen, but I think one day Putin needs an off ramp to end this war and have it be sadly, another Transnistria or Ossetia style frozen conflict.
Well, I will just say that the Crimea was Russian only after the 1774, the Treaty of Kuczuk-Kainarczy, which in which, by the way, Russia obliged to protect Crimea's independence, as it was a Crimean Tatar state, and they obliged to protect its independence. And we will see how Russia guarantee anyone's independence, right? But don't you think that in the case that this war becomes frozen, becomes as different, Putin didn't tell anyone that he was going to denazify them, to conquer them, and in case of Ukraine, he wants to do it. He wants really to change everything in Ukraine. It wasn't the case in Georgia. He just was talking about some parts of Georgia, and now he's talking about whole Ukraine, changing the system in Ukraine, changing the government in Ukraine. And if we let Putin just have those 20% of Ukraine, he's not going to stop. He was just going to breathe for a while, and then he's going to go on and go on, maybe towards the world war.
Well, first of all, I have to applaud you on your mastery of Crimean history, going back to 1774 and the Treaty of Kuczuk-Kainarczy, which Catherine the Great broke in 1783, when she outright overthrew the Crimean Tatar indigenous Muslim Khanates and directly absorbed Crimea as a Tarid province into the Russian Empire. I'm a geek on Crimean Tatars and Crimea, and I've written 2 books on Crimean Tatar history. That's a shameless plug for my books called The Crimean Tatars, by the way. But back to your question, of course you're right, Piotr. Vladimir Putin has a pathological, passionate desire to disprove the separate identity of 35 million Ukrainians who've been living in Ukraine, a land that's been on the map since the 1600s, whose free Cossack people for centuries fought against Russian tsardom and serfdom and tyranny. The Cossack Brotherhood were legendary for standing up for their wild rights and their freedoms, a sort of proto-democracy. They've always had this. The Ukrainians have always inherently had this propensity for free thinking, for a sort of, a latitudinal democracy, whereas Russians have always wanted a strong leader, a Tsar or a Stalin, Father Stalin, or now Father Putin. Putin is pathologically obsessed with using history, with weaponizing history to eradicate the bona fide history of a whole entire people. This is the last time we saw something like this happen was when Hitler decided to exterminate the Jews. He wrote this ridiculous, amateurish history diatribe right before his invasion of Ukraine, which laid out his theory that Ukraine was actually invented by the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, by Vladimir Lenin. You may know that the Communist Party under Lenin and Stalin divided the mono sort of ethnic, in theory, Russian Empire up into 15 separate Soviet socialist republics and small associate autonomous republics. Inside of Uzbekistan, for example, or Tatarstan or Chechnya. And this sort of carved those ethnic groups up into republics and legitimized them with borders. According to Putin's revisionist alternative universe history of the world, this suddenly made Ukraine a separate group, even though they've always been Russians. In his interview with, I'm sorry, I can't call it an interview, in his monologue, unchallenged monologue with Tucker Carlson, he made this point. In fact, he said that it started in World War I with the Austro-Hungarians. They're the ones who invented Ukraine. And he's obsessed with this ridiculous notion that he can denazify or de-Ukraine a country they call Little Russia. So you're right. His ambitions for Ukraine, which are not based in any history that any historian would recognize. Yes, the period of kolonizatsiya, in Russian, the creation of republics, did territorialize and demarcate and give Ukrainians a republic, but that was in recognition of an identity that Russian anthropologists, linguists, and historians who created the borders of these small republics, Karakalpakistan and Tuva, the Bashkortia, these little ethnic groups, the Yakuts up in Siberia, they all got their separate republics based upon historical, linguistic, anthropological research. And the Soviet anthropologists were just recognizing a history of hundreds of years of Ukrainian identity, a different language. I speak Russian. It is not Ukrainian. I can't understand a lot of Ukrainian, even though they're close. Their personalities are different. A lot of Ukrainians in the West and Lviv are Catholic, for example. Ukrainians are much more prone to free democracy. So Putin's ambitions are genocidal. By that I mean the Genocide Conventions of 1948 say that any effort to destroy the identity of a group or in parts of a group constitutes genocide. Putin's ambitions for Ukraine, which have been mouthed in the newspapers calling for the ending of the Ukrainian language. Rusty Novosti had an article calling for the banning of the Nazi Ukrainian identity, de-Ukrainization. This is Orwellian. This is Stalin-esque. To go in and stop them from speaking their language, ban Ukrainian culture, erase its history, destroy its statues and its books and literature. In Russia today, all Ukrainian literature has been removed from the bookshelves in an Orwellian move to erase identity. And in the Russian-occupied territories, they're knocking down cultural monuments, they're knocking down statues, they're banning the use of the Ukrainian language. As a Welshman who comes from the small country of Wales, who grew up speaking a dying language that was repressed by the English, I certainly feel for languages and cultures that are at threat. And I would rank Ukrainian language as under an assault by a superpower and a megalomaniac who's genocidally obsessed. And I don't use genocide lightly. Like Black Lives Matter people say, we're having genocide against the police. No, there was no genocide of African Americans by the police during the Black Lives Matter protest. So the term is often used in the wrong way. But I do believe the clinical definition of genocide is an attempt to erase a people's identity, whether via full-scale military slaughter and invasion or via laws that will inevitably ban Ukrainian language. So you're right. Completely right. This is a much more megalomaniac mission than Putin's invasions of Ossetia or Chechnya in 2000 on the fake premise of those bombings that his FSB carried out in Ryazan and other towns, or Transnistria in teeny Moldova.
Yeah, they even targeted the Scythian sculptures in Ukraine to erase even such history, which is of course pre-Ukrainian, and Russian history, the vision of history that Putin presented in his talk with Tucker Carlson is stolen from Ukraine, and that's most definitely. Thank you very much. Just one more question. My colleague asked me to ask you, what weather do you have outside?
Well, we've had two really, really hyper warm summers here in Boston, which is known for its blizzards, its burans, its big snowstorms. Global warming has stopped our winters from being cold up here in Boston. But thankfully, as a snow lover who loves skiing, I'm happy to report that tomorrow, starting early in the morning, we're going to have a big, beautiful white blizzard. So I'm looking forward to getting out and playing in the snow.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you, Piotr.